This is Module 14 of Unit 2, Ecological Succession. Our learning goals today are describe how terrestrial ecosystems experience succession, describe whether succession occurs in aquatic ecosystems, identify how succession impacts species richness, biomass, and productivity, and explain the importance of keystone species and indicator species. So, throughout the unit we've been in right now, we have examined the biodiversity of ecosystems, including how species evolve and ecosystem services they provide. However, biodiversity of natural communities does not stay the same forever. Change in the species composition in communities over time is perpetuating natural process. In this module, we're going to look at how both terrestrial and aquatic communities change in their composition of species over time. We will also examine how these community changes affect species richness, biomass productivity, and ecosystems. Finally, we will examine the special roles of some species that have disproportionately large effects on communities and any other species that indicators on human impacts of the ecosystem. Okay. So, with that, terrestrial ecosystems experience change known as ecological succession. This is a predictable replacement of one group of species by another group of species over time. Primary succession is the first time that succession will happen. This occurs when there was bare rock or no soil to begin with. In primary succession, the first species to show up are known as pioneer species. So think pioneer just like you would think of as a pioneer from history class. These tend to be algae, lichens, or moss. Once succession has reached its final stage, the resulting ecosystem can be considered a climax community. So this is an example or an image or a graph or a chart, or however you want to say it, of what primary succession looks like. So there is exposed rock, whether that's from a volcano erupting and it's cooled lava, or a glacier has went through and exposed the rock face and there's nothing on it, what have you. There's a bunch of different scenarios where this could be. So what happens is somehow lichens or mosses will get to these places and they will attach to the rock. And those species, the pioneer species, don't need very much as far as nutrients and things like that to grow. They definitely don't need soil, which is a big plus because there's no soil there yet. That's the big difference for primary succession is there's no soil. Once these lichens or mosses attach themselves to the rock, they also put out a chemical which kind of dissolves the rock a little bit and gives them the nutrients from the rock that they need, like phosphorus for DNA and nitrogen and things like that, right? After the lichens and mosses start to die off, they create a little bit of soil from their decomposing matter, and that soil is going to be good enough for our annual wildflowers. So somehow seeds will get here. Let's say this is like an island, like we've been talking about. Maybe a bird was eating some plants on the mainland, flew here, did its business, and planted seeds. And those seeds did not need very nutritious soil, so they went right here. After that, you start to get these things will die off and they will become soil. They'll start decomposing, and then you'll get a little bit more sophisticated plants that need a little bit more nutrition, more sophisticated shrubs, okay, that don't need to grow far from the ground. And then those shrubs will be outcompeted by these plant species that'll be ended up brought here by different means. And then finally, we have our taller, more stable ecosystem. And so this is primary succession. We start with exposed rock face or bare rock, and we end up with our climax community or our secession, is what we call it, the late secession, because these will go through disruptions as we talked about, but it won't go clear back to the soil. So maybe a logging company comes through and cuts these down, or a wildfire happens, and a lot of these um, might be lost, but not the entire ecosystem, right? So soil begins to develop, and the original species are replaced with more advanced species, eventually leading to a forest ecosystem. In this case, that's not always the case of a forest, right? You have different biomes. Okay, so then that brings us to secondary succession. So these are areas that already have soil and have been disrupted by things like forest fires or hurricanes, and they will undergo secondary succession. Secondary succession doesn't take as long, but it's still a similar process. Why doesn't it take as long? Well, the soil is already here, and so no matter if the soil has a lot of nutrients or poor nutrients, it's already there. So secondary and primary succession are two different events. Primary, again, happens on a bare rock face that has just been formed. So usually we talk about lava cooling, which is the easiest one, or a long time ago it had been like glaciers sliding everywhere and cutting open sediment to show exposed rock. Secondary succession again happens after some sort of disruption has happened. So a forest fire seems like it's a really easy example, or a hurricane, something like that, and it doesn't take as long because the soil is already there. So, standard number two, describe whether secession occurs in aquatic ecosystems. The answer is yes, it does. So, aquatic ecosystems undergo similar secession processes as well. This can occur through small changes such as an overturned or exposed rock in a rocky intertidal zone, or water dries up in shallow bodies of water. So, if you flip over the rock in the bottom of a lake, the algae that were living there no longer have access to light, so they're not probably not going to grow anymore. But that top of the rock probably does not have anything growing on it, right? So different species are going to go ahead and move in, such as algae, and the algae is going to act like a lichen or a moss. Doesn't require that much nutrients, just requires something to hang on to and light, and it does photosynthesis. Eventually, those algae get old and start dying, and they become more mud. And that mud can be a good place for aquatic plants to take over, and eventually the aquatic plants take over, and they go through that same process. Well, they'll have that climax community. One thing that's interesting about aquatic ecosystems during succession is that, like a shallow open water lake like this, so what we just said was like a rock is here and it gets algae growing on it, and eventually the algae becomes soil, and then it grows more plants. Eventually, those become soil until we reach the climax community. What actually happens in open water systems or freshwater systems like lakes is the sediment will start accumulating so much that the lake will eventually become just terrestrial because it's filled with sediment. I think that's pretty interesting. Before we go on, make sure that you do check out the differences between marine secession and freshwater secession. They are a little bit different. So, marine secession is like the ocean, and so algae will start to build up on there, and then you will get barnacles that build up, and then things after the barnacles will build up will help get that to that climax community. Okay, standard number three. So identify how secession impacts species richness, biomass, and productivity. Secession begins by increasing species richness, then the biomass, and then productivity. So that makes sense, right? Secession is adding more species to an area that didn't have any species before. So we're increasing our species richness. So we start with one or two species, such as lichens or moss or algae, and then from then on, they die and become soil. And then we increase our biomass because bigger plants can start moving in. Well, when bigger plants start moving in, they're going to die and create soil. So we get more sophisticated plants, and then eventually you get animals or bugs, right? And so all of that is an increase of mass that is living, so that makes sense. And then productivity. We know from module 6 what productivity is, right? And so as you get more species in there, it just makes sense that productivity will then start taking off because you have more species to move around nutrients and things like that. As there are a few species to begin with, the resource obviously start out very high. So the ratio from species to resource is not a lot of species, but there's a lot of resource per species. As more species show up, biomass and productivity increase. Okay, I just kind of covered that. After species have been in an area for a long period of time, resources tend to get used up and competition increases, leading to a slight drop in biomass and productivity. So the way to demonstrate that is with these graphs. So this is the effect of secession on species richness, biomass, and net primary productivity. So you can see here in the years, our grassland looks like we had started out with 40 grasses, then we moved up to eventually we get to this pinnacle forest part. And by here, what that is telling you is that we have used up a lot of our resources. So then things starting to compete, and we know that when things have to compete, somebody has to win or die, or win or lose, and the loser usually dies or moves on. So then it makes sense that our species richness would go down because we have less species in the area because they can't compete anymore or they're dying. Okay, biomass makes sense again. So grass didn't have a lot of biomass, but then as we continue to move throughout the forest, that soil is going to be a lot more nutritious. So then things like shrubs can move in. Okay, well, eventually the shrubs are going to outcompete each other based off of the resources there and starts to die off. And then we get our forest move in, right? And you're like, Mr. Levin, how is that different? Well, then the trees are going to grow and they're going to start outcompeting each other for light. And the taller you can grow, the likely you're going to stay, but the rest of them probably not. And then you can see the same thing happens with our productivity. Okay. 14.4, explain the importance of a keystone species and an indicator species. So some species are not abundant and have a disproportionately large impact on the community. These are known as a keystone species. So in architecture, whenever they are building a bridge, this thing right here or this stone right here, they called the keystone because it was the key to holding everything together. You pull that, the whole thing falls. Okay, so a keystone species, it's only one stone, but the rest of these stones would not be able to be held together without that there. The example that your book gives. It gives a few examples. One of them is a beaver. So beavers, they dam running water, and what that does sometimes is it floods nearby ecosystems, which you think, okay, the flood would not be very good. But some of those animals that are benefited by the flood are like ducks and geese, and during the floods, maybe those plants or trees die, right? And so if the trees die, that might become a home for another animal. And so the beaver just doing its thing is creating more homes for different animals, more habitats. Another one in your book that's mentioned is the American alligator. The American alligator will create holes in the mud for when it lays its eggs or when it's just hanging out there. And those become good water reservoir spots during the dry periods. And so other animals may lay their eggs there, or bugs will use the water that's kind of down in the bottom of it when it's the dry season. If you took biology last year, we all learned all about keystone species like the otter. So the otter keeps the urchin population in check, which then means that the kelp can grow. And without that, um, without the keystone species, that whole forest of kelp was decimated. Keystone species tend to create or change habitats or can serve as population control for other species. So, normally we think as producers as the most important part of our populations because without producers, nobody else has energy. Keystone species might look at that a little bit differently, and they say that the trophic pyramids are run from the top down. Because we've talked about this before, but if you don't have any carnivores going after your herbivores are going to um, overpopulate, eat all their food, and then die, right? So that's the same reason why predators need to live on small islands to make sure that everything is balanced. Another example of a keystone species is a sea star, which are predators of mussels and allow for diverse ecosystems. Your book does go over this. It's a pretty interesting experiment, and if you're in biology last year, we did that as well. So what this guy did is he ended up taking over. He went to a tide pool and he threw out all of the certain types of sea stars and threw them into the ocean. And what happened was instead of more diversity, the predator of the sea star was absent, and so they went down in species richness because just the same species wasn't being regulated. Okay, so we need our keystone species. The other species we're talking about today is the indicator species. Those are which can be demonstrated through characteristics of an ecosystem. These are typically used to determine if there's a negative impact on the ecosystem. So lichens are present on trees because they are sensitive to pollution. So if you live in an area with heavy pollution, you're probably not going to see a lichen. If you don't know what a lichen is, I would Google it. You probably thought it was just discolored tree bark, but that is not the case. Amphibians, they're sensitive to disease because they get a lot of things, nutrients and water like that through their skin. So if there's a lot of things in the habitats that are not good for them, they're probably not going to be there. Okay. Larva flies are sensitive to pollution. The mayflies, they will not be around. Other indicator species. So if you've ever heard like the canary in the coal mine, or you're the guinea pig, like you're the test subject. So a canary in a coal mine, if the back in the day when coal mines used to be a lot more prevalent, what they would do is they would release a canary into the coal mine and make it fly a little bit deeper. If the canary was singing, you could go into the coal mine because it was safe because there wasn't a lot of fumes that were bad for you. But if the canary didn't start singing, then you knew that the coal mine was not ready to harvest yet because there was too many gases in there that you shouldn't be breathing. So that's where that comes from. Another indicator species, and this will help you on your review part, is E. coli. So E. coli is a pretty common pathogen that we associate with poop. And so, if the water has been damaged by humans because of our sewage or things like that, what scientists do is instead of testing for all of the potential pathogens that might be in the water that we may or might not even know about, we know that if we test for E. coli, that'll pretty much tell us if the water is going to be healthy to drink or not. And so if it has E. coli, it indicates that there is probably human sewage in that water source. And if there's no E. coli, then it indicates that that water source probably is pretty safe to drink because it's just a really common indicator species. Okay. I hope all of that made sense to you. Primary succession, again, is when there's no soil. Secondary succession is what happens after a major disruption and there still is soil. Keystone species play a big impact in their environment compared to their population. Indicator species can tell you if things are going well or if they are not going well in an ecosystem, depending on if they are present or not. Let me know if you have any questions.